Hey, sellers, welcome back. Still getting over a cold, so my voice doesn't sound normal to me, anyways. This is going to be the first instance of this. It's going to be a mission briefing that I'm going to do, something to add to the channel. I'm just going to go in depth into the actual real life circumstances of campaigns and or battles, probably affiliated with the squad leader scenarios that Dave and I are going to be playing to some degree. So this first one, I figured we're already doing this, taking up Takrouna scenario number 51, I think it is. Why not do it on that? This is going to be the first one. Hopefully you get some enjoyment out of this. If you're a military history buff, I can definitely see the juices flowing for this. And just give some background into what actually happened in the actual mission. Without further ado, let's get into it. Right, first things first, we'll do some orientation just to bring everybody on the same page so we know what we're talking about. So on the bottom left is an overview of Europe and the Mediterranean and northern parts of Africa. And the area outlined in red is the large portion that you see in the center of the screen. So Tunisia is located obviously on the north coast of Africa, here in the southern fringes of the Mediterranean. It has Algeria on the left, has Libya on the right. You can just see Sicily off to the northeast. And by 1942, just the year preceding the action we're about to take, um, the Algeria and Morocco to the west were controlled by the Vichy French. Now, once America entered the war, and as part of a general move to open up a second front, which is the overall scheme of maneuver in the Africa campaign, is to eliminate the German threat in this region, thereby securing the Mediterranean so that they can open up that second front, something which Stalin had been begging the Allies for the longest time. So we have Vichy French controlling all the lands to the west. We have Libya controlled by the Italians as well as Tunisia. And then, of course, we had England controlling Egypt and staving off German Italian attacks as much as possible. Once Rommel entered the affair, of course, the battle started to turn against the British by and large. And this is only really and this only lasted up until 42. Once the Americans entered the war in December 41, plans were made to do a large-scale invasion onto the North African coast, again with a view to freeing up the Vichy French territories and then pushing the Germans into the eastern half of the desert, keeping them away from the Mediterranean as much as possible. So Operation Torch, as it was called, was going to be the amphibious landings on the north coast of Africa. And this involved essentially three beachheads that were put down. The most eastern one was in the vicinity of Algiers. And this is where the combined Anglo-American First Army, primarily British, but there were elements of Free French as well as Americans, including the American Second Corps, involved in these landings. Once those regions were secured in November of 42, a push was made along the coast towards the east. All right, so we have the First Army pushing in from the west. We have the British Eighth Army once they defeated Rommel at El Alamein in October 42. This was the second battle. The first one was a German victory. But Monty just took over the Eighth Army, and he's able to restructure his forces and lead them to victory. And they ended up pushing Rommel's Africa Corps and beleaguered Italians further west into Tunisia. Meanwhile, the First Army was working its way through Vichy French-controlled Algeria, and eventually they were pushing into Tunisia itself. So this combined attack basically formed this Axis bridgehead, and this was the position of the German and Allied forces around the early beginning of 43. Now, you can see the Germans are all hemmed into a line. It's about 110 miles long, and essentially ran from east of Cape Surat up here, curls around to the south. Eventually, it runs through Enfidelville and onto the Hammamet Gulf off to the east. Um, so, having suffered several defeats in the preceding months, the Germans and Italians are all sandwiched into this area in order to regroup, reorganize, and strengthen. Now, at some point in February 43, um, the German forces were restructured under what was called Army Group Africa, ostensibly headed by Rommel. And but he's not to stay in that position very long. He had two subordinates working for him. One was General von Arman, and the other one was an Italian, Giovanni Mies. And General Arman eventually took over for him as commander of Army Group Africa, and the German chain just moved up to fill the void covered by that. Rommel had been sent back to Europe ostensibly for some health recovery reasons, and he was never to return to Africa, so he was not there to see the end of the war. The Allies, for their part, also took time to reorganize and re-equip their forces, and their view was to capture Tunis, capital of Tunisia, by spring, with a long-term view that they must be in position to open up that second front by later that summer with invasion of Sicily and Italy and going up that way. So by mid-April, it was time to go on the offensive in order to meet that objective. This basically took two forms. One is the Anglo-American First Army would continue to pressure Tunis. That was the primary objective. But in order to fool the enemy, the Eighth Army was to make a concentrated effort to approach from the south. And their objective was basically to cut off Cape Bon here to the right so that they can intercede the Germans along this way, as well as cutting a nice little swath into the Germans for a defensive line. For the British Eighth Army, which is coming up through here, they basically had a problem. One was Takrouna, which we'll get into, but it was it's about a 600-foot lone hill surrounded by other hills, so it's not lone actually. But it had a commanding view of the field around Enfidaville, and therefore any guns that were located up around those hilltops could be directed towards any British forces moving down in the plains and in the open. So it was quite vital to the British effort to secure the high ground in and around Takrouna. So to that end, this was tasked to the 2nd New Zealand Division, as well as the 4th Indian Division to their left, and then to the right in the low ground by Infidaville was the 50th Northumbrian Division itself. Orders of battle. So this is what we're looking at. Now these numbers are quite large and rounded off nicely. I was looking around several sources, and as only Facebook that gave me solid numbers. I was able to find some early reconnaissance reports from the Americans on the German forces, and that lowers the number of troops down to actually about 120,000, essentially fighting forces sandwiched into the area. And that's primarily German and, of course, the Italian First Army. Now, the Army Group Africa was broken down into two main armies, as you can see there. The 5th Panzer Army, which is primarily German, and you had the 1st Italian Army, which primarily Italian, with some German elements, including armor and infantry regiments. Now, in the area that we're going to be focusing on, there's 3 regiments that come into play, primarily the 66th Infantry Regiment Trieste. This was an ad hoc organization that was cobbled together from many other depleted units, especially after the El Alamein second battle. Units were in quite a bit of disarray, and they were restructured and reorganized. So the 66th Infantry Regiment was essentially cobbled together from a core of other disbanded regiments and battalions into what it's into the shape that it has. And they were augmented by some Panzer Grenadiers in various positions, primarily anti-tank and or artillery by and large. So all total, the Axis had, as I said, about just over 100,000 fighting troops, possibly up to 350. But again, these are Wikipedia numbers, and I could see this being more or less maybe the entire North African campaign, although that seems kind of low for the Axis. But I doubt very much there was 350,000 troops in the Axis beachhead. A couple hundred tanks, most of them had been depleted at this point, and that covers a fair number of Italian tanks as well as field guns, including several capture pieces from the British that were incorporated in that as well. Large aircraft support. By and large, the Axis forces were resupplied primarily by shipping, but also by a significant number of aircraft. And that included fighters and bombers as well. But supply aircraft, as a matter of fact, the relief efforts for Stalingrad were somewhat hindered when almost half of the supply transport aircraft had to be directed to support the battle in Africa and resupply those troops that were caught in the cauldron. The British and Americans, for their part, were generally obviously higher morale and vastly outnumbered the Axis. The Lieutenant General Kenneth Anderson was a British officer in charge of the First Army, and of course Bernard Montgomery was taken over the 8th in the late fall of 42. And of course his big claim to fame was the Second Battle of Alamein when he outfoxed the Desert Fox. And one of his units was a 2nd New Zealand Division, primarily composed of, well, New Zealanders, obviously. And they were broken up into several brigades, the 5th and the 6th. And each brigade, of course, had several units inside of, typically 3 battalions, support elements of artillery and engineers and supply and all the rest of it. Inside the 5th Infantry Brigade was a Maori battalion. Now, these are obviously not quite colonial troops or Anzacs. They're considered elite, especially in ASL terms, clearly motivated, and typically led by British officers. All total, the Allies had about 500,000 troops. Again, Wikipedia numbers. Who knows what it actually is. Some manuals from that time have much lower numbers. But again, we'll go with 500,000 for now. And of course, they quite outnumber the Axis in terms of tanks and field guns. While the Germans had better officers and more experience, especially considering the Americans, because they'd only recently entered the war and they hadn't done much fighting in Vichy-controlled Africa. So a lot of them weren't necessarily bloodied and or experienced. However, in sheer quantity of man and material, clearly the Allies have the advantage in that respect. Focusing on the area of concern for us, this is a map I found online. It shows the operations at Infant de Ville from 19 April to 13 May. Most of the action happens in 19 to 20 April when the 2nd New Zealand Division, the 4th Indian Division, start to push into all the hills and try and take the high ground and help deny that terrain to the enemy. As well as key to this, of course, is controlling the vital arteries, any roads that meander through the desert. Obviously have to be controlled and denied to the enemy whenever possible. 5 Brigade, as part of 2 New Zealand Division, was generally tasked with taking Takrouna itself. Here we have an op order for the 5th Brigade, basically breaking down what I've just said. Essentially, so how they achieved their objective was the 5th Brigade on the left here. We have the 21st Battalion and we have the 28th Maori Battalion. The 23rd was in reserve, and the 21st and 28th, their primary objective, as I said, was a road and Jebel Fakour, which would be secured by the 23rd Battalion once this road had been secured by the 21st and the 28th. As part of the 28th objective was, of course, taking Takrouna, including the village, which lies just off to the northeast of the hilltop itself. This is a side view of what it looked like. This is what the Maoris were facing as they were coming up to Takrouna. Now, this attack, when it took off, was going to be started at nighttime. So, obviously, they didn't see what they were getting themselves into, although, of course, daytime recce had been completed the day before. By 2300 hours on the night of the 19th, the attack was begun, and, of course, they approach in pitch blackness. Now, the original plan Um, we'll get into that. This is a view from the top of the pinnacle. Basically, it's an old Berber fort that was situated on top of the hill. It has a commanding view of the plain, as you can see. This is looking to the southwest area. So just off to the left here in this low ground, this is where the Maoris would have set up and began to move closer towards the objective. There's a wadi that you can just make out back here that ran east to west. This is essentially the start line, and they would approach through these olive groves and surrounded by cactus-laden hedges. This is a view of Takrouna village looking up to the northeast. Again, you can see the pinnacle on top. Currently, there's a mosque there. The mosque was still in place at that point as well, and it proved to be an interesting entrance point because this is where the tunnel was located to the top of the hill that led down to below. All right, so 19 April 1943 at 2300 hours, the New Zealand division was supposed to begin its nighttime assault. So leading into the darkness, troops began to move towards their lines of departure, which again was a wadi. It's just off the south of the map. And the attack was supposed to be preceded by a creeping barrage that was advancing at the rate of 100 yards every 2 minutes. So every 2 minutes, the barrage would lift, it would advance 100 yards, and it would drop down another barrage. And of course, the Maoris are supposed to be following up behind that. Now, their original lines of attack, B, C, and A companies in that formation were supposed to advance. This is Takrouna off to the top left here. And they were essentially supposed to initially bypass the feature top and attack it from the northeast, Takrouna village, where it's a much more gradual slope rather than the sheer cliff face that's visible on the west and the southern edges of the pinnacle. C Company was supposed to continue past in the valley in between. There's another hill feature off to the top right, which was A Company's target. And the three companies were supposed to advance and basically move between those two high features, secure the road, and at the same time, Bravo Company would detach a section or two to do some kind of diversionary attack on the base of the hill, while Delta Company, coming up 10 minutes behind, would eventually move into position into Takrouna village, and from there they would actually move into the village proper. Of course, as with most things, plans rarely survive first contact, nor does this one. Given the terrain and nighttime movement, brigade was not in the proper line of departure prior to the barrage opening up. The moving into position again is pitch black, no light obviously. The moon at this point had not risen, and the troops were basically night blind, although they did have dedicated units and sergeants that would link up between the different units to keep them moving forward and make sure that they were staying in contact. And of course, this did not happen. And essentially, the barrage kicks off, and the troops were hurriedly running up behind it, trying to keep pace with it. Unfortunately, because they were not in position, by the time the barrage had lifted and advanced 100 yards beyond, the defenders were starting to regroup, and they were able to get back into the positions and defend the approaches. So the Maoris quickly found themselves under fire, not to mention all this olive groves to the south, and you can just make out the cactus-lined hedges that they used as containment walls. And these are nigh impassable to people. You have to cut them through with machetes. 3 tanks were attached to each battalion to help them with the assault. But of course, you don't have enough men and material to actually force your way through it, and you end up hacking your way through it. Now, several features obviously could have been bypassed, but it clearly plays havoc with your lines of departure and getting to position when you have to deal with those kind of terrain features. In addition to which, a lot of the cactus hedges had been mined by the Germans, and of course, there was a lot of minefields and barbed wire at the base of the hill that the Maoris had to overcome. And of course, good defensive posture. They were always covered by machine gun fire, and there was a lot of casualties leading up into the assault. As mentioned, the units frequently lost contact with all their adjacent units, and by 0200 hours, so 3 hours after H hour, they were still moving into position. They were still shy of their objectives, and at this point, part of the plan had been for two sections from Bravo Company to detach, and they were to form up at the base of the hill and carry out a diversionary attack so that if everything had gone to plan, Delta Company would have been in Takrouna village and they could have come in from the northeast. Obviously, Delta Company was hung up. They'd run into the rear of Bravo and Charlie companies who were held up themselves in this whole area here. And essentially unknown to them, the two sergeants that were picked to lead the diversionary tactic, Sergeants Manahi and Sergeant Rogers, carried on their attack. And they only had 10 men between the two of them. And using cover movement, they were dashing between the rocks, using the darkness to their benefit. And they basically bayoneted and shot themselves all the way up to the base of the hill, and quickly found themselves above and behind the enemy lines, which had been set up in these below the pinnacle itself. At this point, dawn is starting to break, light starting to hit the slopes, and you can quickly see themselves surrounded. There's Maoris below them. Didn't know how many, of course, Maoris above them, and before you know it, the Italians and Germans who were set up in this area had quickly surrendered to the Maori troops. And there was conveniently located a Maori platoon down here, which is able to take all those prisoners, so that Sergeants Manahi and Sergeant Rogers could continue their assaults. Now, their assault, they were not actually supposed to go up the hill, but the battle being what it was, they saw their advantage and they took it. There was telephone wires running down the base of the cliff to the forward positions, and two of the members of this team were able to find those, and they actually used that to scale the side of it. Once they'd scaled the side of the pinnacle, they actually came up. First thing they encountered was a wireless radio operator, so one of the guys captured him, and the other Paka sergeant managed to find an officer as well. And they were basically sitting up there with their two prisoners. Meanwhile, Sergeant Mahoney and Sergeant Rogers had found different ways of ascending the pinnacle, either the easier access to the southeast area here, or by sheer climbing up around the west side of it as well. They crested the hill, and there was minimal presence on top of the hill, and they were quickly able to secure it with their 10 men. They did encounter one Italian officer who was up there, and he quickly ran away, and Sergeant Rogers gave chase, but he managed to lose the Italian somehow, even though there's sheer drops on all four sides of the pinnacle. Unbeknownst to him, this Italian had found this tunnel, and he'd made its way into Takrouna village itself. So by 0700 hours on the morning of the 20th, Takrouna had been secured, the pinnacle that is. The village was still contested and controlled by Italians with their German allies. And once the Italians realized that the pinnacle was lost and their forward troops had been destroyed, they quickly started counterattacking. Italian reinforcements were being trucked in, and troops were quickly fighting over this pinnacle. And the 10 men on top, as well as the troops that can now see that were on the south side of the Takrouna High feature, began to duke it out. And in the face of all that concentrated enemy counterattacks, they were able to successfully hold them off. And eventually, around 1900 hours, the enemy ceased attacking, and it was all quiet on top of the hill. And they had retreated to the west-north slopes, which still controlled by the Axis powers. So by the end of play on the 20th, the situation was such that 28th Brigade was normally in possession of the road to the east. 21 was control of the area to the left of the feature, but the area directly north and behind the pinnacle was still occupied by Italians and Germans. 0600, again, because the lines were being stretched thin at this point, a decision was made to withdraw off the top of the pinnacle, and the Maoris ended up regrouping towards the south. So dispositions at this point were as follows. So you have the 21st Battalion up to the left, You have the 3 rifle companies from the 28th, augmented now by the Delta Company, which again had just joined their fellows, situated just south of Takrouna Ridge, but along the road, which was the main artery that was supposed to be one of their objectives. The decision was made to withdraw the 10 troops from top of the pinnacle back down to their lines so that they could strengthen their line. Unbeknownst to them, they thought they had control of the pinnacle itself, and it was only this area here that was controlled by the Germans, when, to their surprise, they started receiving fire from top of the pinnacle. Apparently, the Italians had re-infiltrated up to the top. Again, they were been using a hidden tunnel system, which basically went from the top of the pinnacle in this vicinity down to the base of the mosque, and from there into the village proper. So using that means, the Italians were able to reinforce the top of the hill. So a decision was made by a commander of the brigade that they would make another assault on the pinnacle, and this time it would be obviously an early daytime morning assault. So this is handed to Sergeant Manahi again because he'd already been up there, so he had some experience. Sergeant Rogers, unfortunately, had been killed by artillery fire in the preceding day, and his only Sergeant Manahi was a senior man that had been up to the top of the hill. And he would lead a fresh assault of 35 men from the battalion, broken up into basically 3 groups. So 2 groups would be sent to rush the mosque around the eastern side of the area, and the 20-man platoon would actually be taking the pinnacle itself. That was the plan, and early in the morning, around 0700-ish, they set off. Now, they were preceded by some concentrated fire. They tried several things. One was battalion mortars. They found the range was too short. So they tried 2-inch mortars. The range was too short again, even though they're firing them almost horizontally. And they basically ended up making the assault without any clear cover fire. However, their assault was essentially unopposed. Whatever had transpired up here by the Italians, they'd eventually retreated back down. So Sergeant Manahi and his troops managed to resecure the top of the pinnacle. And in the process, they also pushed beyond the pinnacle into the village proper. And with the concentrated effort from the rest of the battalion, they were quickly able to secure this entire region, and in the process capturing 323 Italians and a handful of Germans that were along with them. Uh, Finally relieved on the 23rd of April, the 28th Mayor Battalion had suffered 12 officers and 104 other ranks killed, wounded, or missing. The picture on the right is an example of some of the graves that were put at the base of the hill. Again, you can see the pinnacle up on top. To the left, this is Sergeant Manahi. He actually lived to the end of the war. He was up for a VC, Victoria Cross, for those not in the British parlance, and which is the highest battle honor attainable by a soldier. Unfortunately, even though he's recommended by several generals along the way, it was actually only downgraded, and he never ended up receiving a VC. Concerted efforts were made after the war, and especially after he passed away, to increase the honor, but it just never happened. So unfortunately, despite all his valor, and I encourage you all to read some of the links at the end of this video that deal further with what transpired on top of the hill. He's clearly somebody probably deserving of the highest honor available to the British Empire. These are some links of stuff that I've used in the process. So if you have a chance, especially this third link here, it's a nice page on the Maori 28th Battalion from a New Zealander's perspective, where I drew most of my information from, and takes you to this page here. And it's quite a nice chapter on Takrouna, including a nice lowdown of what actually happened, some of the debacle that led up to the actual attack itself, about how they were running into each other and unable to actually get into positions in time, and eventually their success in capturing it, primarily at the hands of Sergeant Manahi and his fellows. So looking at ASL Scenario Archive, it looks like we have 89 scenarios that take place between January 1st, 43 to April 30th in Tunisia, so covering that whole Tunisian campaign. Majority have not been played, looks like. Most of these I don't have access to, Critical Hit or Africa Core magazine. I'm not sure what those ones are on. There's two that strike me as interesting. Two scenarios that will definitely be playing into the Takrouna and the 28th efforts are these two here. We have FT 289 and 290, both available in the latest Lefranc magazine number 15, which I think is available now. Can try and get my hands on that one. There's also more information on the Tunisian campaign itself in that magazine, from what I understand. And of course, when you throw in number 14, which has extra desert boards and more Italian information, it actually does a lot to rehabilitate the Italians, although of course I haven't seen the magazine. It would be nice to get my hands onto it, and I hope to at that point. So yeah, Lefranc number 15 and number 14, if you can get your hands on that. Two key magazines that will help to increase the playability of the areas in and around the Tunisia, and including this scenario playthrough, the taken of Takrouna number 51 of the ASL Scenario Archive. And there we have it. So that was a in-depth analysis of scenario 51, the taken of Takrouna, and what had actually transpired on the nights and days of 19 through 21 April of 1943. Again, it's a bit of I wouldn't say mistakes, but obviously in a scenario you have to condense some information. The actual attack represented by the scenario happened in the wee hours in the early morning of the 20th, not during the daytime like it represented. Elements of the 285th Battalion Fulgor. This unit had actually been renamed as a 3rd Battalion Fulgor as part of the 66th Regiment at this point. What had happened is the Fulgor was their elite paratrooper division, and it was almost annihilated at the Battle of Alamein, the second one. And survivors were grouped into this 285th Battalion, which, of course, after subsequent attacks from the Brits, had actually been reduced even more. And so that corps became essentially a battalion that had been reassembled under the 66th Infantry Regiment Trieste. Probably not best represented by 346 has been my experience, based on the history anyways. They are supposed to be elite. Yes, they surrendered en masse, so there's got to be some kind of balance in terms of game purposes, but consider that they're supposed to be elite paratroopers. 346 first lines, maybe not the best, but again, you understand where the balance has to come into play. Obviously, your Maoris are represented by the 10 men that went up the hill. And again, you have to make something that's playable, so that's one of the reasons why it's set up like that. But yeah, that's my experience with the taking of Takrouna. So hopefully this has been of some use to you. These kind of in-depth things. I'm going to be doing more of these, and I'm hoping that they strike a chord with you and feed that military historian aspect that we all enjoy, or I think a large part of us enjoy when we do recreate these World War scenarios, and having a chance to actually go through and replay something that actually happened, including Sarmanai and his, he should have won the VC for his actions, but such as it is. Yeah, I hope you guys find this fun and enjoyable. Let me know in the comments what you think. If this is a worthwhile addition to the initial recce. I may, depending on how long these go, this one's going to be about a half hour or so, tack these onto the initial recce, but it might be too long overall, and I don't want to extend the format too much. Some of you guys like long videos, some of you don't, so it's hard to keep a balance. I may keep these separate, but for now, this is the initial mission briefing of the taking of Takrouna, and hopefully you guys had some fun. We'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.